Let the day go. Let whatever you are carrying loosen its grip on you, even slightly, even just for now. The story that waits for you tonight is not a story of evil in the way we ordinarily mean that word. It is older than that, and stranger, and in some ways more sorrowful. It reaches back not to the beginning of this world, but to a time before the world had a beginning at all, to a place of pure thought, and music, and fire, where a being who would one day be called Sauron existed in a form so beautiful that even the word beautiful is too small, too earthbound, too creaturely to contain it. Let your breathing slow. Let the pillow hold the weight of your head. This will take some time. Good stories always do. The entity we are speaking of had a name before that name. In the tongue of the Valar, the great powers who shaped the world at the command of the One, he was called Mairon the Admirable. Not a name given in flattery or in political ceremony, but a name earned through the quality of his actual nature, through the precision of his craft, the orderliness of his thought, the deep and genuine pleasure he took in making things well. He was a Maya, which is to say he was a spirit of the Second Order, lesser than the Valar themselves, but still inconceivably vast compared to anything that walks on legs or breathes through lungs. The Maya were not gods exactly, but they were not angels in any simple sense either. They were more like concentrated principles, aspects of Ilúvatar's own thought made particular and personal and capable of will. Mairon served Aulë, the great smith, the maker of mountains and metals and the deep strata of the world's bones, and this is where the first important thing lives, the thing worth pausing over before we move anywhere else. Sauron was not trained in war. He was not schooled in deception from the beginning. He came to his terrible later purposes through a route that began in a craft workshop at the heart of existence itself, in a place where the air smelled of heated iron, and the floor was dusted with the fine grey powder of stone being shaped. He was a craftsman. He cared about the right arrangement of things. He cared about things working as they ought to work, fitting together without waste, without slippage, without the friction that comes from disorder. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. We speak of Sauron as the Dark Lord, as shadow and malice given name and purpose, and all of that is true. But it came later. What he was first, and in some sense what he always remained underneath the accumulation of everything that followed, was a being who loved order so much that the disorder of a free world eventually became intolerable to him. His evil did not come from indifference to beauty, or from a fundamental contempt for the things of the world. It came from a love of correctness that curdled, over ages so long they exceed our counting, into the conviction that only he could be trusted to make things correct. That is a subtler kind of darkness than simple malevolence, and it is a more dangerous one. Morgoth came first, of course. Melkor, the mightiest of the Valar, who had turned his vast will inward and then outward in destruction rather than creation. It was Morgoth who noticed Mairon, who saw in that precise and orderly spirit something that could be used. The seduction was not crude. Morgoth did not appear to Mairon in some smoke-wreathed form and offer him power in exchange for loyalty. The approach was philosophical. Morgoth argued that the vision of Ilúvatar was incomplete, that the world as being made was wasteful and inefficient, that a stronger organising intelligence could make it better, more harmonious, more perfectly itself. And Mairon, who had spent uncounted ages caring deeply about exactly that kind of perfection, listened. He had not sought corruption. He had sought completion. That distinction matters more than it might initially appear. When he turned from all service to Morgoth's, Mairon, who would in time acquire a new name, Guldur, the Dread, and later still the name we know, Sauron the Abhorred, did not immediately become the shadow that haunted the Third Age. There were long, slow stages. He became Morgoth's greatest lieutenant, his most capable servant, his most trusted architect of strategy. And in doing so, he learned a second craft alongside the first, the craft of domination, the art of bending the will of other beings toward a desired end. This was not so different from what he had always done, he might have told himself. The smith shapes the metal. The metal does not choose its shape. Why should the governance of peoples be any different? He used many fair forms in those ages. He wore beauty like a cloak he could take on and off, appearing to elves as Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, arriving in a form of such arresting grace that even the wise were not immediately certain he was not what he claimed to be. He used his genuine skill, his craft, his deep knowledge of how things could be made more excellent as the lure through which he drew others toward his actual purpose. And his actual purpose by then had become something he probably would not have recognised in that long-ago workshop of Aulë's. Not the perfection of craft for its own sake, but the subordination of all other wills to his own single organising intelligence. Not order as a gift to the world, order as a cage built around it. The modern reader, if we can call them that, the person who has followed the story of the Third Age through the account that reached us, that reader knows Sauron only as absence and menace, as the lidless eye, as the nothing at the centre of a vast military machine. But absence is not what Sauron was. Absence was what happened to him over the long course of his defeats. What he was in the fullness of his original nature was a presence of almost overwhelming intensity, a being of fire and will and craft and the iron-bright love of things being precisely as they should be. The tragedy of what he became, and there is a tragedy there, even if it does not diminish the harm, is that the very qualities that once made him admirable became, over age after age, the instruments of everything he did that was terrible. Let the room be quiet for a moment. Let your eyes stay where they are. There is nothing to look for, nothing to solve, nothing to understand more fully than you already do. The fire that Mairon carried was real. The capacity for craft and care was real. What happened to it over those uncountable years is something we will spend this whole long evening tracing, not to excuse it, but because understanding its roots is the only way to understand why the ring he made was the particular kind of catastrophe it was. A weapon forged from malice is dangerous, but a weapon forged from love of order, from the desire to make everything finally correct at last, that is a different kind of thing altogether. That reaches deeper, that is harder to destroy. Let yourself rest in that thought for a while. The history is patient. It has been waiting 12,000 years or more by some reckonings. It will wait a little longer while you settle, while your breathing slows to something like the rhythm of a calm tide, while the last tensions of the day make their way quietly toward the door. There is nowhere to be tonight except here, in the slow and ancient dark, listening to the very beginning of a story whose end you already know, but whose beginning, the real beginning, the beginning before the beginning we usually tell, turns out to be something different from what we expected. Something sadder, something more human in its way than the shadow that came later. We begin at the beginning. We always should. There is a question that most tellings of this story do not ask, because the answer is inconvenient for the shape of the narrative we prefer. The question is this: what would Mairon have become had Morgoth never found him? Had the most powerful corrupting intelligence in the history of Arda simply not noticed that precise and orderly spirit working in Orly's forge, or noticed and decided there were easier targets? What then? The honest answer is that we cannot know, and that uncertainty is worth keeping close rather than dismissing. The qualities that Morgoth saw and exploited in Mairon were real qualities. The love of craft was genuine. The desire for things to be arranged correctly, efficiently, without waste or slippage. That desire, in a different context, might have produced something the world would have celebrated rather than feared. There are other Maiar in the mythology who served with complete faithfulness, and whose names are associated only with light and making, and the quiet excellence of work done well. Mairon could have been one of those. He was not because of the shape of his particular history, but the possibility was there, and its presence in the background of everything that followed is part of what makes the story so much more complicated than a simple tale of good and evil. The process of Mairon's turning, the transition from Annatar, the gift-giver who could still wear beauty and use genuine skill to draw the elves into collaboration, to the Sauron of the Third Age, who could no longer appear as anything other than a concentrated and terrible will, was not a single moment. It was a long erosion. Each choice in the direction of domination over craft, each decision to use knowledge as a tool of control rather than a tool of making, each betrayal of the genuine relationship with Celebrimbor and the Smiths of Eregion cost something from the store of what he had been. Tolkien's mythology has a consistency about this that is worth noting. The beings in it who engage in prolonged deception and manipulation do not keep their original nature intact beneath the deception. The deception becomes them. The manipulation becomes their nature. Sauron did not start the Third Age secretly still Mairon underneath the eye and the shadow, and the voice that issued commands from Barad-dûr. Mairon was genuinely gone. What remained was what the choices had made, which is to say that the most frightening thing about Sauron by the end of his story was not that he was evil disguised as something good, but that he had been something good, and had, through his own choices over thousands of years, made himself into something entirely different. The night you're in right now is full of that kind of slow change, if you pay attention to it. Not Sauron's kind, not the darkening kind, but the ordinary kind, the kind where the hour that begins one way has by its end become something quieter and more settled and more itself than it was when it started. Hours do that. People do that. The question that Mairon's story asks and leaves open is which direction the slow change goes. Not whether change happens, because change always happens, but whether what you become in the changing is closer to or further from what you most deeply were at the beginning, before the choices accumulated. That question does not require an answer tonight. It only requires being held gently, the way you hold anything in the dark that is too large to resolve, but too true to put down. It is also worth noting, as the darkness settles fully and the mind releases its last grip on the day, that Tolkien himself wrote about Mairon's fall with a specific quality of sorrow that he did not apply equally to all his villains. Morgoth was written with a certain grandeur of scale, the largest kind of evil, almost too vast for grief. But Sauron, in the private letters and the unpublished materials, carries a different register. He is the one Tolkien describes as capable, had he ever genuinely repented, of tremendous good. The capacity was real, and the corruption of it was therefore real loss. And Tolkien seems to have wanted the reader to feel that loss as loss, rather than as simple relief at the defeat of an enemy. The loss of what Mairon could have been is woven into the story as a kind of background grief, audible if you listen for it, silent if you do not. Breathe in slowly, hold it just a moment, then let it go. We are moving now from what Sauron was in his origins to what he chose to do in the Second Age of the world, when the memory of Morgoth's defeat was still relatively recent, and the lands of Middle-earth were quieter than they would later become. Not peaceful exactly, not safe, but quieter. Longer shadows lay between the trees and the sky burned its ordinary colours, and the elves who remained in the mortal world were building and learning and creating, with a seriousness and a beauty that still registers across all the ages that followed as one of the finer things that Middle-earth ever produced. Into this relative quiet Sauron came as Annatar, and he came bearing gifts. The rings of power were not his idea alone. The great smiths of Eregion, the elven craftsmen led by Celebrimbor, who was himself the grandson of Feanor, and so carried in his blood a legacy of making things of power that exceeded anything else attempted in Middle-earth. These were already extraordinary artificers. They had a relationship with craft that ran deep, that was spiritual as well as technical, that understood the making of beautiful things as a way of touching something real about the nature of existence. When Annatar arrived, speaking the language of craft, demonstrating a knowledge of techniques that even Celebrimbor had not encountered, the conversation that developed was genuine in some dimensions. Sauron, whatever he had become, had not lost his actual skill. He was truly the greatest craftsman then alive in Middle-earth, and the collaboration that followed between him and the smiths of Eregion was not a performance on both sides. It was real on one side and a long, slow seduction on the other. The rings were made over decades, 16 of them, and then separately 3 of exceptional power that Celebrimbor made without Sauron's direct involvement. The 3 that would remain uncorrupted, the 3 that Gandalf and Galadriel and Círdan would eventually carry. But Sauron knew about the rings as they were made. He had advised on their fundamental architecture, had shaped the techniques even when he did not shape the metal directly, and when he withdrew from Eregion and went back to his forge in Mordor, he carried with him a knowledge of those rings that was intimate enough to become the basis of something else entirely. The mountain of Orodruin, which men would later call Mount Doom, had fires that Sauron had not made but that he understood how to use. These were not ordinary fires. They were a place where the fabric of the world's making was still thin, where the deep energies that had been present at the original shaping of things were accessible, where the boundary between spirit and substance was permeable in ways that did not apply elsewhere. Into those fires, over a period of labour that lasted years in its most intensive phases, Sauron poured the making of the One Ring, and what he poured into it was something that the word ring is nowhere near adequate to describe. He poured his will, not a representation of it, not a symbol of it, not a token or a key. He poured the actual substance of his own being, his power of command, his capacity for domination, the deep organising intelligence that was his most fundamental quality, the fire of his Maya nature that had never been extinguished through all the long corruption of his allegiance to Morgoth and beyond. Tolkien himself was very precise about this. Sauron put a great part of his own will and power into the ring. This was not a metaphor. The ring was, in a real and literal sense, a piece of Sauron, an extension of his self into an object that could persist even if his physical form was destroyed. Consider what that means for a moment. Consider the audacity and the strangeness of it. A being of fire and will and ancient craft, deciding that the best way to ensure his dominance over the world's other rings of power was not merely to forge something stronger, but to invest his own essence, his own identity, into an object. He gambled his continuity of self on the belief that the ring would never be destroyed, that the destruction of something so powerful and so wanted was practically inconceivable, that whatever happened to his body, his will would persist in the ring and could eventually be reassembled around it. He was right, for a very long time. He was right for so long that the gamble came to seem almost not a gamble at all. When he put on the One Ring for the first time and spoke the words that burned on its surface in the black speech, the language of domination he had himself devised, the other ring-bearers felt it immediately. They felt a consciousness reaching into them, reaching for the thread of power in the rings they wore, reaching for control, and they took off their rings before he could complete the seizure, and the strategy failed at its first point of contact, and Sauron was furious with a fury that shook the western lands of Middle-earth. He came against Eregion in force. He destroyed it. He broke Celebrimbor under torment and took the 16 rings by force. And in Celebrimbor's final act, the greatest smith of that age managed to send the 3 uncorrupted rings away before they could be seized, though he died before he could send word of where they had gone. The One Ring persisted through all of this, through the long siege, through the war that followed, through the drowning of Númenor, which we will speak of in its own time, through the assault on the last alliance, through the loss of his physical form when Isildur took the ring from his severed hand. The ring persisted because Sauron had built it to be nearly indestructible, by any means short of the fire that made it, and because he had made it with a portion of his will so fundamental that its destruction would be genuinely catastrophic for him, in ways that ordinary defeat was not. He could be defeated in form, and yet persist, as long as the ring persisted. He knew this when he made it. He considered it a feature, not a flaw. He was right to consider it so. And that is precisely why, when the ring was finally destroyed at the end of the Third Age, the result was not a simple victory. The result was something more complicated, and in some ways more unsettling than that. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, which is a habit of the anxious mind, and not of the resting one. You are here in this slow, dark evening, and there is time enough for everything. The ring sat in Sauron's making for years of the world uncounted. It was beautiful and it was terrible, and it was both of those things because its maker had been beautiful once, and terrible for longer, and had put both into it. The gold of it caught light that wasn't there. The inscription on its surface could only be read in fire, which tells you something about the conditions under which it was written. It was not made for comfortable reading. It was made for dominion, for the completion of a vision that had started long ago with a craftsman who simply wanted everything to work as it should. Somewhere in the ring, that original desire was still there. That is, if anything, the most disturbing thing about it. Let the thought settle, let it go where it wants to go, and then let it drift. The night is long and there is more to trace, more root structure to follow, more consequence to understand. Sleep, if it comes, is welcome. The ring will still be there in the story when you return to it, sitting in its mountain fire, waiting with the patience of something that belongs to a will, vast enough that waiting is not a suffering but simply a condition, like the cold that waits in ice, like the silence that waits inside a bell before it is struck. We will follow it where it leads, but not yet, not quite yet. For now, simply let the word ring sit in your mind like a small gold circle on a dark surface. That is enough for this moment. The black speech itself is worth a moment of attention, because it tells us something about Sauron's conception of what he was making. Languages are not arbitrary systems. They encode ways of thinking, ways of relating to the world, priorities and hierarchies that their speakers absorb through the act of using them. The language Sauron devised for his servants was a language optimized for command. It had no subjunctive mood in the ordinary sense, no grammatical structure for things that might be or could be or were wished for. It had extremely precise structures for obligation and compulsion, for hierarchy and order of operations, for the relationship between the one who commands and the one who is commanded. When the inscription on the ring was read aloud in the black speech by Gandalf at the Council of Elrond, the accounts described the reaction of even the elves in the room. A chill that had nothing to do with temperature, a weight that descended on the hall, a momentary but real sense that something had been invoked that was older and darker than anything present in that room. The language carried its maker's intent in its very phonemes. It sounded like domination because it was designed to sound like domination. The other rings of power deserve a moment of attention alongside the One Ring, because understanding what happened to them is part of understanding what the One Ring was designed to do. The 7 rings given to the Dwarf Lords were partly a failure and partly a success from Sauron's perspective. They could not dominate the dwarves in the way he had hoped. Dwarves have a nature resistant to the kind of spiritual erosion that affected the 9 men, something in the deep earthiness of their character that kept the rings from reaching their innermost selves. But the 7 rings still corrupted, still fed and inflamed the dwarvish greed that was already part of their nature, causing several of the great dwarf lords to become consumed by the accumulation of gold to a degree that damaged their kingdoms and their relationships with other peoples. 3 of the 7 were eventually destroyed by dragons. The other 4 Sauron eventually recovered directly. They were not total failures. They were just smaller successes than he had intended. And the 16 rings given to various lesser beings, the human lords, the sorcerers, the ones who became the Nazgûl and others who did not last long enough to become anything at all. These were the rings that confirmed for Sauron that the strategy would work, that the architecture was sound, that what he was building toward with the One Ring would operate on the fundamental logic he had designed it to operate on. There is a craftsman's satisfaction embedded in that confirmation that sits uneasily alongside everything else we know about him. He was right about the craft. The rings worked as he had designed them to work. The One Ring worked as he had designed it to work. Whatever else we say about him, and there is a great deal else to say, he was genuinely a master of making. The tragedy of craft divorced from ethics is that the craft itself continues to function with its original excellence regardless of the purposes it's put to. One more dimension of the ring's making is worth carrying with you into the quiet. The question of what Sauron felt in the moment the forging was complete. He had poured more of himself into that object than he had ever poured into anything. He had done, in a sense, the largest and most committed act of making in his entire existence. Larger even than his work with Celebrimbor, because this time he was not making a craft object for someone else's use, but an extension of his own self that would persist in the world independent of his body. Did he feel something when it was finished, sitting there in the fire's light catching the glow? The accounts do not say. The accounts were written by those who had suffered its effects. But the craftsman's satisfaction in a thing completed, that quality was part of his nature for too long to have been entirely absent, even in that moment, even in that fire. Settle a little deeper. If there is any part of you still holding tension from the day, let it release now. The story we are tracing does not need you to grip it. It will unfold at its own pace, and your only task is to be present in the way that a person is present when they lie still and let darkness gather around them like a quiet tide. We are now at the end of the Second Age, at the moment that all the long corruption and all the long making finally came to a crisis. The last alliance of elves and men had marched on Mordor. They had besieged Barad-dûr, the great dark tower, for 7 years. 7 years of siege, which in the reckoning of that age was not considered extraordinary, because both sides in the struggle were capable of endurances that no mortal military has since attempted. 7 years, let that settle. Longer than most wars in recorded human history. Sauron, by the end of the Second Age, had been many things and had worn many forms. He had been Annatar the gift-giver, had been the dark general who destroyed a region, had been the great Maya who crossed the sea to the island of Númenor and there, in a generation's time, managed to corrupt a civilization from the inside with such thoroughness that the Númenorians attacked the shores of Valinor itself. An act of such hubris that Ilúvatar directly intervened, changing the shape of the world, drowning Númenor beneath the sea and removing the undying lands from the circles of the world altogether. Sauron's physical form was destroyed in that drowning, along with almost everything he had built in Númenor. But his will survived, and he returned to Middle-earth in a form that was darker and less fair than anything he had previously worn, because the capacity for fair appearance was diminishing with each loss of form, each reshaping. The alliance that opposed him was extraordinary by any measure. Gil-galad, the last High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth, stood at the head of an elven force drawn from realms that had long held enmity with each other. Elendil, the lord of the Númenorian survivors who had fled the drowning and established the kingdoms of Gondor and Arna, led men who were themselves reduced from the heights their civilization had reached, but still formidable, still carrying in their bloodlines and their craftsmanship the memory of what Númenor had been before Sauron unmade it. Together they had the strength to press Sauron back. Together they had the strength to hold the siege for those 7 long years and finally to break through. The battle on the slopes of Orodruin, when Sauron came out himself to fight, cost both Gil-galad and Elendil their lives. The imagery of it, in the accounts that survived, is tremendous and terrible. 2 of the greatest beings then walking in Middle-earth being destroyed in a direct confrontation with Sauron, who was himself diminished but still far beyond the capacity of any single mortal or elf to overcome. It was Isildur and Anarion, the sons of Elendil and Elrond, who was there as Gil-galad's herald. It was the combined action of those who remained standing that finally brought Sauron down. And when Sauron's form collapsed and his great physical presence dissolved into something that could not yet reconstitute itself, the ring fell from his finger, and Isildur picked it up. Here is the moment that we should sit with for longer than we usually do, because it is very easy, knowing what we know, to call what happened next a failure of will, a weakness of character, a moral collapse. Isildur took the ring and would not destroy it, though Elrond urged him and the fires were right there, the fires of Orodruin still burning, the only place in all the world where the ring could have been unmade. He said it was his weregild, his payment for the deaths of his father and his brother. He said it was a prize of war, a trophy of victory. And then he rode north, and 3 years later, on the banks of the river Anduin, his company was ambushed by orcs, and he fled into the water, and the ring slipped from his finger in the river's current, and Isildur was killed by arrows before he reached the far shore. The ring would lie in the riverbed of the Anduin for nearly 2,500 years before Sméagol found it, and Sauron would spend roughly that same period slowly rebuilding his strength, reforming his will around the constant pulse of the ring's continued existence. But the question of why Isildur did not destroy it, why standing there at the edge of the only fire that could have ended everything he turned away, this is not simply a question about one man's moral character. It is a question about the ring's nature. The ring was not passive. The ring was not a gold band waiting to be used. The ring had within it a portion of Sauron's will, his actual will, not a symbol of it. And that will was directed above everything else toward its own survival. From the moment Isildur touched it, from the moment its warmth spread through his fingers and it adjusted its size to fit his hand exactly, from the moment it whispered to the deepest chambers of his desire the promise of what he could become if he kept it, the ring was working. Not with words, not with visible manipulation, with the subtle pressure of a will so ancient and so vast that a mortal man feeling its influence would experience it not as external pressure but as his own deepest conviction. He would not have said the ring was making him keep it. He would have said that keeping it was obviously the right decision, that of course it should not be destroyed, that the arguments for doing so were somehow thinner and less compelling than they had seemed a moment before. This is the ring's deepest horror, and it does not diminish Isildur to name it. Even the wisest in the Third Age, Gandalf, Galadriel, Aragorn, refused to touch it, refused to carry it, understood with whatever wisdom they had accumulated across centuries or millennia that their judgment in proximity to the ring could not be trusted to be their own judgment. Isildur had no such foreknowledge. He had just watched his father die. He had just participated in the destruction of the greatest enemy the world of that age had known. He was a man in grief and exhaustion, and the peculiar disoriented state that follows enormous violence, and the ring arrived in his hand warm and beautiful and full of the promise of meaning, and he kept it. We should probably sit with the compassion of that rather than the condemnation. He was not weak, he was human, and the ring was precisely designed for humans. Elrond felt the loss of that moment for the rest of the Third Age. He was there. He urged Isildur toward the fire, and Isildur did not go, and then Sauron's Ringwraith future was sealed, and the long, slow waiting of the Third Age began. In the account that came down to Frodo Baggins thousands of years later, Elrond would say that he could not force Isildur into the fire, that he could not compel another being's choice. And that is true, and it is also an incomplete accounting of that afternoon, because Elrond knew, the moment Isildur turned away, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. He would spend the rest of the age trying to prepare for the consequence. He would fail, repeatedly and sometimes brilliantly, and his home would become the place where the broken sword was kept, and where the last heir of Isildur would eventually grow up, carrying without knowing it the consequence of that single moment on a dark mountain at the end of the world that had been. Sleep comes, or it does not. Either way, the night holds you. Either way, the story is being kept safe in the dark until you want it again. The fire of Orodruin has burned for all the ages of Middle-earth, patient and underground, waiting for the weight of the ring that was made in it, and that it was the only place capable of unmaking. 3,000 years! 2,500 years of that spent with the ring sleeping in river mud, and Sauron sleeping in whatever formlessness his diminished will could manage, and Isildur's choice persisting in the world like a stone dropped into water, the ring spreading outward through all the years that followed. We will trace those rings, but first let your own thoughts quiet. Let the fire of Orodruin burn somewhere far and deep, and below the level of anything that needs your attention tonight. The 7 years of the siege of Barad-dûr before the final confrontation are worth dwelling on a moment longer than the accounts usually allow. 7 years is a human generation. In those 7 years, the alliance held its shape despite the enormous pressure of maintaining a military coalition across the racial and historical divisions that had previously kept elves and men in frequent conflict. The logistics of feeding and supplying an army in Mordor's volcanic wasteland, the ongoing skirmishing with Sauron's forces along the siege lines, the psychological weight of besieging a tower that radiated dread in every direction. All of this was sustained for 7 years by the sheer determination of the two kings who led it, Gil-galad and Elendil. When both of them died in the final confrontation, the alliance did not immediately dissolve. Isildur and his brother and Elrond held it together long enough to take the victory, and that coherence under the pressure of grief and exhaustion is itself a form of courage that the story tends to compress past in its eagerness to reach the moment on the mountain. Anarion, Isildur's brother, died during the siege, struck by a stone hurled from the Dark Tower, one of the siege's casualties. His death is mentioned briefly in the accounts, and then the narrative moves on, but it is relevant to the moment at the fire. Isildur arrived at the edge of Orodruin having lost his father and his brother in the same war. He was the last of his family's direct line present on the field. The ring was warm in his hand, and it whispered to him of continuation, of legacy, of meaning. And here was a man who had just watched his family's meaning be purchased at the price of their lives. The argument the ring made in that moment was not an argument that reached for his ambition. It reached for his grief. It told him that the ring was a reason why the deaths had mattered, a reason why the war had been worth it, a reason why what remained of his family had a future proportionate to what they had sacrificed. The ring was very good at finding exactly the right argument for exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. Grief was the argument for Isildur. The ring found it and used it, and he turned away from the fire. Elrond, walking back down from Orodruin without the victory he had been hoping for, carried something with him that would shape his entire approach to the Third Age that followed. The knowledge that he had been there and had not been able to change what happened. This is not a simple guilt. It is more complicated than guilt because he had done everything he was able to do. He had urged, he had argued, he had made the case for the fire as clearly as any living being could make it, and it had not been sufficient. That insufficiency, the gap between the right action clearly recommended and the right action actually taken, is something that leaders of large and long efforts encounter repeatedly, and the way Elrond processed it over the following 3,000 years was to build at Rivendell a place where the capacity for deliberation and wisdom was concentrated and preserved, as if the right environment for decision-making maintained long enough and with sufficient care might eventually produce the outcome that could not be produced in that one crucial moment on a dark mountain. He was not wrong to try. He was not entirely right either. But the trying is what the Third Age of Rivendell represents, and there is something worth honouring in it. Let your breathing find its own pace now. You do not need to direct it. The body knows how to breathe in the dark, and the mind, given enough space and enough quiet, begins to follow the body's knowledge rather than insisting on its own. We're moving into the long middle space of Sauron's story tonight, the space that the histories glance across quickly, because nothing large and dramatic happens in it, but which is actually, if you sit with it, one of the most haunting stretches of time in the whole of Tolkien's mythology. It is the space of waiting, the space of slow rebuilding, the space of a will that cannot die, persisting in a form that barely deserves the name form, turning its attention toward the future with a patience that no living creature could sustain, because no living creature was quite what Sauron was. After the fall of his body on the slopes of Orodruin, Sauron was not gone. This is the crucial thing, the thing that explains everything that follows across 3,000 years of the Third Age. He was reduced. He was weakened in ways that would take enormous time to address. But the will that had been poured into the ring was still his will, still connected to whatever remained of his spirit. And as long as the ring existed, that will had an anchor in the world. He could not take a fair form. He could not appear as Annatar again, could not wear the face of something beautiful and trustworthy, but he could think. He could reach. Very slowly, very carefully, he could begin to draw power back to himself from the ring's continued existence, as a plant draws water through roots that persist, even when the visible growth above ground has been cut away entirely. The first 1,000 years or so of the Third Age passed in near total absence. Sauron was a ghost of his former self, not even a shadow exactly, more like the idea of a shadow, a coldness in certain old and dark places, a wrongness at the edge of perception that travellers in the worst corners of Middle-earth sometimes reported and could never quite describe. The world above continued. The kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, the heirs of the Númenorian survivors, built and governed and in Gondor's case reached a pinnacle of civilization that represented the highest point of human achievement in the Third Age. The elves who remained continued their long, slow, irreversible fading, spending their grace on the world and finding the world increasingly unable to hold them. Dwarves delved deep and found things they had not meant to find. The long peace of the early Third Age was real, and it was fragile, and it rested on the assumption, which turned out to be wrong, that the defeat of Sauron at the end of the Second Age was more permanent than it was. Around the year 1000 of the Third Age, something that the Astari called a shadow and a fear began to be felt again in Greenwood the Great, the vast forest that stretched across the north of Middle-earth. By the year 1050, that forest had begun to change. The great trees did not change in their nature, but something moved through them that made the movement of the light different, that made the creatures living in the undergrowth behave differently, that made travellers who had to cross the forest take detours of weeks rather than walk through the darkening interior. By the middle of the Third Age, Greenwood the Great had acquired a new name. Mirkwood. The name was accurate. The wood was murked, darkened from within. The light that reached its floor changed in quality from the clear filtered green of a healthy forest to something thicker and less certain. Sauron had found a place to shelter. Dol Guldur, a hill in the southern part of what had been Greenwood, became his fortress, not the great volcanic fortress of Barad-dûr that he would later rebuild in Mordor, but a more modest stronghold, more appropriate to his diminished state, sufficiently obscured that for centuries the wise were not certain who or what was at its centre. The thing at Dol Guldur was called the Necromancer for want of a better name. It was not Sauron's name for himself. It was the name that the edges of his activity earned him, the name that attached itself to the rumours of dark things that moved out from the southern Mirkwood and made the roads less safe and the forests less welcoming. Gandalf was the one who eventually went into Dol Guldur and found out the truth. He went in disguise, in shadow, at great personal risk because the thing inside the fortress was not something that could be approached directly without confrontation, and confrontation was not yet the right move. What he found there, deep in the vaults of the hill, was Sauron. Not the full Sauron, not the Sauron who had shaken the world at the end of the Second Age, but a Sauron who was unmistakably present, unmistakably rebuilding, unmistakably beginning to draw his old power back toward himself through the thread of the ring's continued existence somewhere in the world. Gandalf brought this news back to the White Council, and the White Council debated. And Saruman, who was already in the earlier stages of his own corruption, already consumed by his private obsession with the ring, counselled delay. He counselled patience. He argued that the shadow at Dol Guldur was not yet dangerous enough to warrant confrontation. Saruman had reasons for that argument that he did not share. He had been searching for the One Ring himself. He had deployed his network of agents and informants across the entire territory of the Anduin and its tributaries, looking for a ring lost in a river 2,500 years ago, and he was not yet ready to abandon that search. An assault on Dol Guldur would drive Sauron away from his current refuge and back to Mordor, which Saruman suspected was Sauron's preferred stronghold, and Mordor was closer to the Anduin, closer to the ring's likely resting place, which meant that if Sauron moved to Mordor and also began searching for the ring, Saruman's advantage in the search might narrow considerably. This is a small and private calculation made by one individual operating in bad faith within a council he was supposed to be serving honestly. And it is worth noting that this small private calculation contributed directly to Sauron being allowed to rebuild his power for another 60 years before the council finally acted and drove him from Dol Guldur. He had been expecting them. When the council finally moved against Dol Guldur, Sauron was already in the process of transferring his presence to Mordor. He had rebuilt enough of his strength to survive the move, to leave behind sufficient remnants of his power in Dol Guldur to slow the council's advance, while the main body of his will relocated. He returned to the plain of Gorgoroth, to the shadow of Orodruin, to the ruins of Barad-dûr that had been broken at the end of the Second Age, and that he now set about rebuilding with a concentrated fury of reconstruction that would take decades, but would ultimately produce a fortress stronger and darker than the original. He returned to his heartland. He returned to the mountain where the ring had been made. He returned to the geography of his own deepest power. If you're still following this story, if the words are still reaching you through the slow drift towards sleep, then pause on this image for a moment. The dark tower being rebuilt, stone by stone, over decades, by a will that had been patient for 3,000 years and was now no longer willing to be patient. Barad-dûr going up again in Mordor, the eye forming at its peak, the 9 ring wraiths, the Nazgûl, returning to their master's service now that he was strong enough to call them. And somewhere in the world, in a hole in the ground under a hill in the Shire, a small creature of the kind called Hobbit, who had been given a ring by a wandering adventurer who had found it in the dark, carrying that ring around without knowing what it was, protected from its worst effect by a quality of will and heart that even Sauron had not planned for. We will come to that, but for now, simply note that Sauron's long diminishment was ending. The slow gathering was complete. The Third Age was about to become something different from what it had been. If this story is carrying you towards sleep, let it carry you all the way. The history will keep. Subscribe if you want the next chapter to be waiting for you when you come back. There are more nights like this one ahead, more long stories that want only the dark and the quiet and a resting mind to receive them. For now, though, let the image of the rebuilding tower be the last thing you hold. Vast and dark and patient, rising in the east, lit from below by fires that never go out. Testimony to a will that found ways to persist through losses that should have ended it. There is something almost magnificent about that persistence, even in its wrongness. Something that the cold and the dark and the long patience of a winter night can understand, if nothing else can. The Astari, the 5 wizards who arrived in Middle-earth in the 3rd millennium of the Third Age, were themselves a response to the slow rebuilding of Sauron's power, though they were not sent to confront him directly. They were sent as counsellors, as guides, as beings whose purpose was to encourage and strengthen the resistance of the free peoples, rather than to exercise the kind of direct power that would simply replace one dominating force with another. They arrived in old men's bodies, deliberately limiting themselves, operating under constraints that were partly imposed and partly chosen, a decision that makes more sense when you understand the mythology's consistent position that the solution to Sauron's kind of order was not a different and better order imposed by a different and better overlord, but the cultivation of the capacity for self-determination in the peoples who were being threatened. The wizards were not supposed to win the war for Middle-earth. They were supposed to make it possible for Middle-earth to win its own war. Of the 5, 3 disappear from the main accounts early on. The 2 blue wizards, Annatar and Pallando, who went east and are not heard from again in the surviving records, and Radagast, who became absorbed in the natural world to such a degree that his original purpose was effectively set aside in favour of the care of birds and beasts. There is a case to be made that Radagast's apparent dereliction of duty was actually not a failure at all, that the networks of communication he maintained with birds and animals, the intelligence those networks provided, was a genuine contribution to the effort even if it did not look like what a wizard was supposed to do. Gandalf used Radagast's connection with Gwaihir, the eagle, at a critical moment, but the official assessment of the Valar, insofar as we have it, was not charitable to the birds and beasts man. Saruman's corruption, meanwhile, was the most consequential of the Astari failures, because it came from inside the position of greatest authority. He was the head of the Order. His turn from the mission toward his own agenda meant that the resources and information and influence of that position were redirected away from the purpose they were supposed to serve. This is the shape of institutional corruption that we recognize from contexts much more familiar than the Third Age of Middle-earth. The leader of an important effort who has privately concluded that the effort's goals are less important than his own, who continues to use the effort's structures and credibilities while quietly redirecting their substance. Saruman in Orthanc, with his Palantir and his spy network and his industrial program, was not a rogue actor who had stepped outside his role. He was a corrupted insider who was using his legitimate role as cover for something else. That is a harder thing to detect and a harder thing to address than simple opposition, and the story's treatment of it is more realistic than it is usually given credit for. If the story is carrying you towards sleep, let it carry you all the way. Subscribe so the next long night's journey is waiting when you return. Sleep well. You are resting now. You may not have noticed it happen, but it did. Something shifted in the last few minutes, some knot in the body's architecture loosened, some insistence that the mind had been carrying put itself down without making a decision to do so. The story continues, but you do not have to pursue it. You can let it find you instead, the way a very slow current finds the bank of a river, without urgency, without violence, with only the soft and patient weight of water that has somewhere to go and all the time in the world to get there. Tonight we are thinking about the ring, not as an object but as a relationship, not as a weapon but as a bond, the bond between a created thing and the will that created it, which in this case was not a metaphorical bond or a sentimental one but a metaphysical one, a structural connection as real and as physical as the connection between a heart and the body it beats inside. The rings of power were all, in different ways, an attempt to solve a problem that the elves felt deeply, the problem of impermanence. Middle-earth was changing. The great forests that had covered it in the First Age were thinning. The mountains wore down, however, slowly. The rivers changed their courses. The animals of one age were not the animals of the next. Everything that was made with love in one generation had to be made again by the next, and something was always lost in the remaking. Some quality that the first makers had and the later ones did not, simply because the first makers had lived closer to the making of the world itself and carried something of that primary vitality in their hands. The rings were, in some readings, an attempt to arrest that decay, to preserve what was beautiful in the world against the tendency of all things in time to become something lesser than they were. Nenya, Narya, Vilya. The 3 elven rings that Sauron never touched, and that Celebrimbor made in his own craftsmanship separate from any of Sauron's direct instruction, these worked, in their way. They preserved. Lorien under Galadriel's ring remained an enclave of the First Age inside the Third, its trees larger than trees in the outer world, its light carrying a quality that visitors described as golden and changeless, its sense of time different from the time outside its borders. Rivendell under Elrond's ring held the quality of a world that had already passed, where the grief of lost things was honoured, and where memory was preserved with such care that it remained alive rather than merely recorded. The preservation worked, and the cost of that preservation was that when the one ring was destroyed and the power of the 3 elven rings was also broken, those preserved places declined almost immediately. The One Ring's destruction did not free Lorien. It unmade Lorien slowly but irreversibly because the preservation that had sustained it was structurally dependent on the same fundamental architecture that the One Ring shared. But the Ring's relationship to Sauron was different in kind from the Elven Ring's relationship to their bearers. The Elven Rings expressed the will of their bearers. They were tools of great craft, but they were tools. They served, they did not compel, they enhanced rather than dominated. The One Ring was not a tool, it was an extension. Sauron had not merely invested power in it, he had invested selfhood. He had poured into it the particular quality of will that made him himself, that organising, dominating, insistent intelligence that had been his defining characteristic since the days when he was Mairon in the workshop of Aulë. When the ring was separated from him, something was genuinely missing from his being. Not just power, identity. The ring was a piece of Sauron in a way that went deeper than the metaphorical and was closer to the literal. This is why every extended encounter with the ring in the Third Age, whether we are speaking of Gollum's 500 years with it, or Bilbo's 60 years, or the brief periods when it passed through the hands of others, left such distinctive marks. The ring was not simply a tool of domination that happened to be very effective. It was an instrument of a particular kind of the will, and extended proximity to it meant extended proximity to that will, and extended proximity to that will reshaped the beings it touched in the direction of that will's own nature, toward possessiveness, toward the belief that the self's continuation was the most important thing in the world, toward the narrowing of care until only the ring itself remained at the centre of the bearer's attention. Gollum, after 5 centuries, had become something that had almost no nature of its own anymore, only the ring's nature and the ring's desire for its own continuation. He was less a creature than he was a lesson in what the ring did to beings it was allowed to fully colonize. Frodo felt this too, though he was more resistant than almost any other bearer had been. His resistance is worth examining because it reveals something true about the ring's fundamental design. Sauron had made it for domination. He had made it to work on the desire for power, on the ambition to be greater than one's circumstances allowed, on the longing for mastery over other wills. But hobbits, and Frodo in particular, had a relationship to ambition and to power that was genuinely different from what Sauron had designed for. They were not ambitious. They were not aspirants to greatness. The thing they most wanted was usually the warmth of a fire and a decent meal, and the company of people they already knew. The ring's hooks found less to grip in that kind of nature. Not nothing. The ring's influence was real and grew over time, and eventually even Frodo could not willingly release it. But slower, more resistible, for longer. The ring's life as an anchor worked in both directions. It anchored Sauron in the world, gave him a thread to persist by, a basis for eventual recovery, a reason that he could not be entirely unmade even by complete physical destruction. But it also anchored itself in the world by attaching to each bearer in turn, creating a relationship that made the bearer as reluctant to release the ring as the ring was reluctant to be released. This mutual attachment was not an accident. Sauron had designed something that wanted to be kept, because something that wanted to be kept was something that would eventually find its way back to him. Every attachment it formed, even an attachment with a bearer Sauron had not chosen and did not control, was a thread in a web whose centre was Sauron himself. Gandalf understood this better than most. His refusal to take the ring, when Frodo offered it to him at Bag End in what seems like a straightforward gesture of burden sharing, was not false modesty, and was not performed caution. It was genuine recognition that his nature, the Maya nature that was his actual deep self beneath the old wandering form he wore in Middle-earth, was precisely the kind of nature the ring was most dangerous for. His desire was to do good. His temptation would be the ring's whispered promise that with it, he could do good faster, more effectively, more completely. That all the incremental efforts of his centuries of work in Middle-earth could be made decisive in one enormous act of power. He knew the ring would frame that offer in terms that would be very hard for him to reject. So he rejected it before it was made. He rejected it completely and in advance. That is not weakness. That is a more sophisticated understanding of his own vulnerability than almost any other character in the story demonstrates. The ring sitting in the fire of Orodruin was the only place where the anchor could be cut. Every other place, every other fire, every other form of destruction that Frodo or anyone else might have been able to attempt would have been insufficient. Not because those fires were not hot or those forces not strong, but because the ring was made specifically in Orodruin's particular deep fire, and only that specific fire, that fire with its connection to the original making, had the relationship to the ring structure that made unmaking possible. This is another feature of Sauron's design. He made the ring unmakeable everywhere except in his own territory. If you wanted to destroy it, you had to bring it to him, or at least to his mountain. He considered this clever. He considered it a security feature of such elegance that the ring effectively guaranteed its own safety by making the one path to its destruction run through the centre of his power. He was right about the cleverness. He was right about almost everything, actually, except the one thing he could not have designed for. A will small enough and simple enough, and just barely sufficient, that it got as far as the edge of the fire before finally giving way. Let your thoughts go where they want to go, and then let them stop wanting to go anywhere. The fire of Orodruin is burning at the centre of a story whose shape you already know, and knowing the shape is not the same as understanding the weight of it. The ring was a piece of a being, not a weapon, a piece of a self. When it was destroyed, it was not merely an artifact that was unmade. Something more personal than that was ended, and whether that something deserved to be ended, whether the self that the ring contained deserved the destruction that the ring's destruction brought, is a question that the story answers in one way, and the night, and the silence, and the long patience of the dark may answer in another. Rest now. More remains. Bilbo Baggins' relationship with the ring over 60 years, from finding it in the dark of Gollum's cave to giving it up with great reluctance at Gandalf's urging in the corridor of Bag End, is the most extended study of long-term ring exposure in the Third Age that does not end in complete destruction of the bearer's self, and it is worth examining carefully, because Bilbo's relative resilience reveals something about what the ring could and could not do to certain kinds of people. He did not become Gollum. He became, if anything, more himself over those 60 years, more active, more curious, more given to writing poetry and reading and planning adventures, while also becoming more possessive of the ring and less willing to discuss it, and more irritable when anyone implied he should part with it. The ring had not erased his self. It had, if anything, extended it past its natural term. But the extension came at a cost that was only fully visible in the famous moment at the party, when the ring slipped onto his finger instead of into his pocket and Bilbo disappeared, was invisible for a moment, before Gandalf called him back. That moment of invisibility was more significant than it appeared. The ring made its bearers invisible to ordinary sight, yes, but the invisibility was not a simple optical trick. It was a movement between planes of existence, a partial step out of the ordinary physical world and into the shadow world, the world where Sauron's will operated and where the Nazgûl existed most fully. Every time a bearer put the ring on, they stepped briefly into that world, and that world was not healthy for mortal beings. The step back out was increasingly difficult the more times it was made. Frodo, by the time the ring was destroyed, found the ordinary world periodically becoming thin and transparent in a way that was deeply disturbing, found himself almost able to see through it to the shadow world beneath, whether he wanted to or not. The boundary that the ring dissolved between those two registers of reality did not restore itself fully just because the ring was taken off. Repeated exposure left permanent thinning. The ring's behaviour during Frodo's journey through Mordor showed something that its behaviour in the Shire had only hinted at. As it approached the source of its making, it became heavier. Not physically heavier. Again, it was famously light in ordinary terms, but heavier in the sense that its pull on Frodo's consciousness became more demanding. Its whispered argument for its own preservation grew louder. Its weight on his attention increased until it was almost the only thing his attention could find. This was not the ring punishing Frodo for trying to destroy it. This was the ring doing what the ring had always done, asserting itself, insisting on its own continuation, communicating the urgency of its own survival to anyone in a position to affect that survival. Near Orodruin, Frodo was in the best position of anyone in Middle-earth to either preserve or destroy the ring. The ring communicated the urgency of its own survival to him, at a volume and an intensity that was proportionate to the proximity of the risk. It was, from the ring's perspective, doing exactly what it was designed to do. The hour is late, or perhaps it is early. The hour in question is the one that belongs neither to the day just ended, nor to the day about to begin. The hour that is purely itself and belongs entirely to the dark. If you are still here, still following this slow thread through the history of a world that was and yet was not, then you are in good company. These hours are good for long stories. These hours are good for the kind of thinking that moves slowly and does not press for conclusions. We are going to spend some time tonight with the Nine, the Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths, the Uleri and the Black Speech. Not as monsters, though they became monstrous, as cautionary figures, as the most complete demonstration anywhere in Middle-earth's history of what the ring could do to a willing recipient given time enough to do it. The 9 men who became the Nazgûl were not ordinary men. This is the first thing to understand about them, because if they had been ordinary men, the story the ring made of them would not be so instructive. They were kings, sorcerers, commanders, the most powerful and accomplished human beings of the Second Age, each extraordinary in his own domain, each already the kind of person who had bent the world somewhat toward his will through the exercise of his own gifts and his own determination. Sauron chose them precisely because of that. The rings of power that the 9 received were calibrated for that kind of person. They enhanced what was already there. They made the powerful more powerful, the ambitious more effective, the great longer lived than the merely mortal. And in the beginning, the 9 rings delivered on exactly those promises. The accounts that survive from the early period of their wearing are not accounts of catastrophe. They are accounts of rulers who became more capable, of sorcerers whose arts deepened, of men who found that the scope of their achievement had expanded in ways that confirmed everything they had believed about themselves and what they could become. The rings made their bearers feel, in the early years, that they had finally been given the instrument their gifts had always deserved. This is the ring's most insidious quality, not that it deceives immediately, but that it delivers first. It builds trust through a period of genuine benefit before the cost of that benefit becomes apparent. The cost was fading. It was not dramatic. It was the slowest thing imaginable. Over decades and then centuries, the 9 ring-bearers found that the world was becoming more transparent to them, more permeable, less solid, less insistently physical. They could see things that ordinary humans could not see. They could perceive the spirit world that underlies the physical one, could see the shapes of things as they existed in the deeper register of reality. And that might have seemed like a gift too for a while, except that the process was not stopping. The transparency was increasing. The physical world was not becoming more visible to them. It was becoming less visible. They were, generation by generation, year by year, hour by hour, becoming more wraith than man. By the time they had become fully Nazgûl, by the time the transition was complete enough that they could no longer be said to exist primarily in the physical world, they had no will of their own in any meaningful sense. What remained of their original selves was not nothing. The Witch King, their leader, retained a quality of dark intelligence and tactical brilliance that reflected who he had been before. Khamûl, the second, had specific domains of sensitivity and weakness that traced back to his original nature. The 9 were not identical, as the same emptiness is not identical in 9 different rooms, but they were all empty of the independent selfhood that had made them who they were, and in that vacancy, Sauron's will filled every available space. They were extensions of him. They were his will given 9 bodies and 9 swords, and the capacity to move through the world and instill terror in every living thing they passed. The terror they inspired was not simply the terror of a threatening physical presence. People who encountered the Nazgûl reported a specific quality of dread that did not feel like ordinary fear, not the fear of being hurt, not even the fear of being killed, but something deeper, something that the accounts describe as a feeling of absolute cold, as if not just warmth, but meaning was being drawn out of the air around them. The hobbits on Weathertop, the army before the Black Gate, the ordinary people of Minas Tirith during the siege, who heard the cry of the Nazgûl flying overhead in the dark and felt, in their own words, that hope itself had left them. This effect was partly the residue of the 9 rings they still wore, which allowed them to operate on the part of the mind that processes not danger but futility. They made you feel that resistance was not merely difficult but meaningless. We should sit with that for a moment, with the particular quality of what the Nazgûl represented as a consequence of the ring's extended relationship with their souls. Sauron had not intended to create beings who inspired despair. He had intended to create powerful servants who could enforce his will. What he had actually created through the mechanism of the 9 rings over centuries were beings who were themselves such complete demonstrations of the ring's ultimate tendency, the erasure of the self in favour of Sauron's will, that their very presence communicated that tendency to everyone around them. They were not just weapons, they were arguments. Their existence was the argument that Sauron's victory was inevitable, that resistance meant becoming what they had become, that the only alternative to submission was the extinction of selfhood that they embodied. The Witch King, their captain, had particular significance at the end of the Third Age, because the prophecy attached to him, that no living man could kill him, turned out to be technically accurate in a way that its author could not have foreseen. It was Eowyn, a woman, and Merry, a hobbit, who unmade him on the Pelennor fields. The method of his destruction is worth noting. A blade enchanted specifically against the ringwraiths, striking at the place where his being was most concentrated, and then the direct confrontation of a human will, Eowyn's, undisguised, unfrightened, looking directly at the hollow shape of what he had become and naming it insufficient. These together were what ended the Witch King. The specific ingredients of his destruction were the opposite of everything he represented. The personal, the small, the individual human refusal to accept what his existence was arguing. The modern echo here extends all the way to the ring's final journey. Frodo carrying the ring toward Orodruin was carrying it through a landscape haunted by Nazgûl, through a world that their long existence had made darker and less certain, through the argument of futility that their presence sustained across the whole of Mordor. Every step of that journey was made against the accumulated weight of 9 lives that the ring had consumed and turned into evidence for the proposition that the ring could not be resisted. And yet, the small party moved. Slowly, haltingly, with great cost to its members, but it moved. There is something in that movement that the Nazgûl, in their faded and ring-dominated condition, could not have predicted, because what moved it was exactly the kind of small and stubborn and unmagnificent persistence that their original greatness had never equipped them to recognize as a form of strength. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. The Nazgûl are far away, somewhere in the cold dark of a history that has long resolved itself one way or the other. They are not here. What is here is the ordinary dark of an ordinary night, which is warmer and softer and more human than anything the 9 ever moved through in their long, diminished centuries of service. That warmth is not a small thing. That ordinary safety of a dark room and a resting body is not nothing. It is, in fact, exactly what the ring was designed to make seem insufficient. And the fact that it does not seem insufficient, The fact that it feels right now like enough is a kind of small resistance that the story does not often name, but that it everywhere implies. Be here, that is enough, more than enough. The accounts of the Witch King's actions over the long centuries of the Third Age are not simply accounts of a military commander doing his master's bidding. They are accounts of what a being becomes when every quality that originally distinguished it has been slowly replaced by the single quality of its master's will. The Witch King was, by the time of the War of the Ring, a being of extraordinary tactical intelligence. That quality had been preserved and even enhanced by the ring's influence. But it was intelligence entirely without scruple, entirely without the capacity for the kind of self-doubt or self-questioning that makes even a brilliant military mind capable of genuine error. He could not second-guess himself because there was no self to second-guess, only the extension of Sauron's certainty operating through a body that had once been a man's. This is, in some ways, the ring's most complete success. The creation of a being who was more effective at certain kinds of action than its original self had been, precisely because all the friction of individual will and personal uncertainty had been removed. The Witch King's campaign against Arna, the northern kingdom of the Númenorian heirs, was one of the defining events of the third millennium of the Third Age, and it is relevant to the War of the Ring in ways that are sometimes underappreciated. He conquered Arnor and destroyed it, leaving the north without a unified kingdom, scattering the descendants of Isildur's line into a remnant people who became the Rangers, wandering guardians of a territory that no longer had a court or a capital or a formal political existence. Aragorn was born into that remnant. He grew up as a ranger before he knew what he was and the specific qualities he developed in that life. The ability to move without being noticed, to survive in harsh country, to know the land without the land knowing him, to protect without being recognized as a protector. These were all qualities that the destruction of Arna had made necessary. The Witch King's success in the north had, in other words, accidentally produced the conditions that would eventually shape Aragorn into exactly the kind of leader the reunited kingdom would need. There is something quietly devastating about the Nazgûl's presence at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, in the context of what we have been tracing tonight. They were the 9 most powerful men of the Second Age, now reduced to hollow instruments of the will of the being who had corrupted them, and they flew above the greatest battle of the Third Age in a war for the freedom of the world, on the side of the thing that freedom was being defended against. If there was any residue of consciousness remaining in them, any flicker of awareness that they had been kings, that they had once fought in their own names for their own reasons, there is no evidence of it. The ring had completed its work on them so thoroughly that even the concept of regret was unavailable to them. They were the argument against the ring carried to its furthest logical conclusion, and the argument was still fighting, right up to the moment Éowyn and Merry gave it the answer it had not expected. The cold that the Nazgûl carried was not metaphorical. Those who encountered them in the wild reported actual drops in temperature in their vicinity. Frost on the grass before dawn, breath visible when it had not been visible before, the cold of deep winter arriving in autumn air. This physical cold was a side effect of the Wraith-State. Beings that exist primarily in the shadow world rather than the physical one carry with them the quality of that world, which is cold in the way that deep space is cold, in the way that the absence of warmth is cold, not the cold of ice, which is a physical substance and can melt, but the cold of a place where warmth has simply never been. The Nazgûl brought that cold with them wherever they went, and it preceded them like an announcement, and everything alive in their path felt it as wrongness, before it felt it as fear. The night has deepened around you. You may not have registered it happening, the way you rarely register the moment when one kind of breathing becomes another, when the active mind becomes the receiving mind, when the day's weight settles into the mattress rather than remaining in your shoulders. We're going somewhere extraordinary now, somewhere that in some ways is the most heartbreaking single story in Tolkien's mythology, a place and a civilization that represents both the highest point of human achievement in the history of Middle-earth and the most complete demonstration of what Sauron could do to a culture he was given extended access to. We are going to Númenor, and we will go gently, because the story of Númenor deserves gentleness, the way any great loss deserves to be approached with care rather than with the briskness that we sometimes apply to irreversible things. Númenor was the island given to the Edain, to the men who had fought on the side of the Valar and the Elves in the great wars of the First Age, who had proven themselves allies in the struggle against Morgoth, and who were rewarded with an island raised from the sea between the shores of Middle-earth and the western shore of Valinor. It was not Valinor. The men who lived there were still mortal, still subject to the gift that was also the doom, still destined to leave the world at the end of their lives in whatever manner Ilúvatar had arranged for them. But they were longer lived than any other men in the world's history. In the early generations, Númenorian kings lived for several centuries, and even in the later diminished generations, their lifespans were measured in scores of years rather than the mere decades allotted to lesser men. They were taller, stronger, more gifted in craft and learning and the skills of governance. They built ships unlike anything else afloat in Middle-earth. They crossed the Great Sea and established communities along the coasts of Middle-earth, learning the languages of those places, teaching and trading and building. They were magnificent. Sauron's problem with Númenor was that it was beyond his reach. His strategy in Middle-earth relied on proximity, on the ability to corrupt through contact, through the slow introduction of bad ideas and worse premises into the minds of people who were already inclined towards certain weaknesses. But Númenor was across the sea, and Sauron was not a sailor, and the Númenorians who came to Middle-earth's shores were wary of him, even at the height of his power. The great king Ar-Pharazôn, the last king of Númenor, was the one who changed that calculation in the most unexpected possible direction. He came to Middle-earth with the largest fleet ever assembled and demanded that Sauron submit to him, and Sauron, recognizing that his military forces were not sufficient, recognizing that a different kind of strategy was required, submitted. He let himself be taken back to Númenor as a prisoner. He was not a prisoner for long. The accounts of his rise within Númenorian society are accounts of a being deploying every skill he had ever developed, every art of persuasion and flattery, and the slow introduction of compelling ideas on a culture that was simultaneously at the peak of its material power and in the depths of a spiritual crisis that made it susceptible to exactly the kind of argument Sauron was equipped to make. The Númenorians in the later generations had become obsessed with their own mortality. The gift that the early generations had accepted with grace had become, over the centuries, a source of consuming fear. They watched the elves who sometimes visited their shores and saw beings who did not die in the ordinary way, whose faces did not change across the generations, who carried their memories across millennia and bore no diminishment from time's passage. And the contrast with their own situation, however excellent by the standards of other men, however long the 3 centuries of their kings, became a wound that never fully closed. Sauron understood this wound immediately. He had been in Númenor for a few years before he was allowed any real influence in the court of Ar-Pharazôn, but he used those years in study, in observation, in the patient accumulation of understanding of exactly how this culture's deepest anxieties were shaped and what kind of argument would find those anxieties and speak directly to them. When he was finally admitted to the inner circles of the court, he began to present, very carefully and over a long period of time, an alternative theology. He spoke of Morgoth, his former master, not as the enemy, but as the true lord of the world, the one whose authority the Valar had usurped, the one who could offer what the Valar refused to give. He spoke of death not as a gift or as a mystery, but as a punishment that the Valar had imposed on men to keep them servile. He spoke of eternal life as something that could be seized, could be taken by force if necessary, could be obtained through the right rituals performed to the right lord. He said these things slowly, with the patience of a being who had learned over thousands of years how to move a mind without the mind feeling moved. It took him less than 2 decades. In less than 2 decades, working from a position that had begun as prisoner, Sauron had become the most influential voice in the court of the most powerful civilization in the world, and the civilization was moving in a direction that could only end in catastrophe. The Temple of Morgoth that he had constructed in the middle of Númenor's greatest city was the most visible sign. The sacrifices performed in it. And here we speak only in the most general terms, only in the terms of a civilization's self-destruction, were a measure of how thoroughly the inversion of Númenor's founding values had been achieved. A civilization that had begun as an ally of the light had, through the patient and expert work of a single corrupting intelligence, been turned into a vehicle for the worship of the being that represented the light's most complete rejection. Ar-Pharazôn's assault on Valinor, the building of the great fleet, the arrogant crossing of the straight road that was forbidden to mortal men, the landing on the shores of the Undying Lands, this was the culmination of everything Sauron had been working toward. Not the outcome he preferred, perhaps. What followed destroyed Sauron's physical form along with Númenor itself. But in another sense it was exactly what he had wanted. The final proof that he could take a civilization of human beings and redirect it entirely away from anything resembling its own nature or its own values toward a purpose and an endpoint that served only his design. The island went down. The sea swallowed everything. 9 ships of the faithful, led by Elendil and his sons, escaped eastward and established their colonies in Middle-earth. And from those 9 ships came Gondor and Arnor, and from those kingdoms came Isildur and Anarion, and from Isildur came the line that ended in Aragorn. The thread from Númenor to the War of the Ring is direct. The Palantiri, the seeing stones that Sauron used in the Third Age to corrupt Denethor and later Saruman, were Númenorian technology, gifts from the elves to the Númenorian kings scattered across the successor kingdoms. The specific grief that haunted Gondor throughout the Third Age, the sense of a height once reached and now being slowly left behind, the awareness of a golden age that was over, was Númenorian grief, inherited through the bloodlines of the ruling families. Even Aragorn's particular burden, the weight of a heritage he could not escape and had to prove worthy of, was a Númenorian weight. Sauron had destroyed the island, but the shadow of it persisted in everything that came after. The way the shadow of a vanished mountain persists in the shape of the land around where it used to stand. And somewhere in all of that, there is the question of whether Sauron knew what he was doing to himself as well as to them. He had destroyed Númenor. He had accomplished what he set out to accomplish. But he had destroyed his own fair form in the process, had made it impossible after the drowning to appear as anything beautiful, anything trustworthy, anything other than what his long history of choices had made him. The lie of Annatar was no longer available. What remained was the I, the presence of unmediated will, the thing that could not disguise itself as anything other than what it was. In destroying Númenor, Sauron had also destroyed the last version of himself that retained any trace of what Mairon had been. It is worth wondering, in the quiet of this late hour, whether he noticed, whether something in him registered what was gone, whether the one who had once been called the Admirable, the craftsman in Aulë's workshop, had any sense at all of the shape of his own loss. If you are still with us, and the fact that sleep has not quite taken you yet is its own kind of welcome, let yourself drift a little. The story of Númenor is not in the main books in its fullness. It lives in the accounts that were assembled from older records, in the histories that Tolkien left incomplete, and that were assembled afterward by other hands. It is a story that feels like something recovered from deep water, which is appropriate because the island itself was recovered from deep water, only in the sense that its memory was recovered. The island itself is gone, swallowed by a sea that was specifically commanded to swallow it. Something that beautiful and that corrupted should probably not come back. Some things are lost and should remain so. Rest now, while the idea of that great island sits somewhere at the edge of your sleeping thoughts, golden and drowned. The faithful of Númenor, the minority who had held to the original relationship with the Valar, who had refused to participate in the worship at the Temple of Morgoth, who had preserved the old language and the old customs and been persecuted for doing so in the later generations of the kingdom. These were the people on the 9 ships that survived. Elendil and his sons were among them, and the community they represented carried something forward through the drowning that would not otherwise have survived, the memory of what Númenor had been before Sauron arrived. Not the later Númenor of the Great Fleet and the assault on Valinor, but the earlier Númenor, the island of craftsmen and sailors, and people who had a genuine and uncorrupted relationship with the elves and with the world's deeper orders. Gondor in the Third Age was built from that memory. Its architecture, its lore, its palantiri, its relationship with the elves of Lindon, its specific quality of civilization. All of this was an attempt to reconstruct on Middle-earth's shores something of what had existed on the island before the shadow fell on it. The palantiri deserve a separate moment of attention in the context of Sauron's long influence, because they represent a specific kind of harm that he was able to do through a technology he had not made and did not own. The Seeing Stones were ancient Númenorian artifacts, and their legitimate use was communication and far-seeing, the ability to look across great distances and consult with other stones, to coordinate governance across the wide territories of the Númenorian successor kingdoms. Sauron, working from Mordor with the one stone that had been kept in Minas Ithil and that fell into his hands when Minas Ithil was captured and became Minas Morgul, could reach into any palantir that was used openly and in its normal mode of operation, and could control what the user of that stone saw. Not absolutely, not without effort on the user's part to resist, but for users who were not warned, who did not know what they were dealing with, the stone became a window through which Sauron could show selected truths, things that were real but assembled into a picture that served his purposes rather than the viewer's understanding. Denethor, steward of Gondor and one of the most gifted men of the Third Age, was Sauron's primary victim through the Palantir in the Third Age. He had found the stone of Minas Tirith and used it in secret, without telling Gandalf or anyone else, believing his intelligence and his will were sufficient to use it safely. He was partly right. For many years he did use it, and the information he gathered through it was real and often useful, and helped him govern Gondor effectively. But Sauron was always on the other end, and over the years the picture Sauron constructed for him, real facts assembled into a false totality, had its effect. By the War of the Ring, Denethor had concluded that the war was lost, that Sauron's victory was inevitable, that the most responsible thing he could do for his house and his city was to ensure a Pyrrhic ending rather than a surrendered one. He was wrong, but he was wrong on the basis of real information that had been curated over decades to produce exactly that conclusion. That is a subtler form of corruption than anything physical, and it is the form Sauron had always been best at. If the story is carrying you towards sleep, let it carry you all the way. Subscribe so the next long night's journey is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Wherever you are in the drift between waking and sleep, stay there. Do not try to come back, and do not try to go further. That threshold is where the best stories reach you, where the images arrive most vividly, and the connections between things become most clear, where the mind has stopped insisting on its own interpretation and can simply receive what is offered. Tonight we are going to spend time with the people who understood Sauron best, who had studied him longest, who had the most information and the most experience and the best intentions, and who still, despite all of that, made errors that almost proved fatal. We are going to spend time with the White Council and with the particular failure that results when very wise people allow the perfect to become the enemy of the merely adequate. The White Council was formed at Rivendell in the year of the Third Age 1000, when the shadow at Dol Guldur first became alarming enough to require a formal response from the most senior powers remaining in Middle-earth. Its members were the heads of the Istari, Gandalf and Saruman foremost, and the most powerful of the remaining elves, Galadriel, Elrond, Círdan. These were beings of extraordinary age and accumulated wisdom. Gandalf had walked in Middle-earth for more than 1,000 years at that point. Galadriel had been alive since the years of the trees, before the sun was made, and carried in her memory the direct experience of Valinor itself. Elrond had been present at the War of the Last Alliance, had stood on the slopes of Orodruin, and watched Isildur decline to cast the ring into the fire. The collective experience in that room when the council met was probably measured in tens of thousands of years. Saruman was chosen as the head of the council because he was, by general acknowledgement, the most knowledgeable about the rings of power of anyone then remaining in Middle-earth. His knowledge was genuine. His years of study were real. When he spoke about the mechanics of the rings, about the architecture of Sauron's strategy, about the specific qualities of the One Ring and what would be required to find it and counter it, he was drawing on actual scholarship that no one else could match. This is one of the more painful aspects of Saruman's story, and it is a pain that will matter later. The expertise that made him valuable was also the expertise that made him vulnerable. He understood the ring so completely that he could not stop thinking about it. He could not stop imagining what it would mean to have it. The study and the desire were always entangled in him, and the entanglement deepened over centuries until they were no longer distinguishable from each other. The error the council made was not ignorance. It was the error of incomplete action, of knowing that something had to be done, and then doing a version of it that was calibrated to their own convenience, rather than to the actual requirements of the situation. When they finally drove Sauron from Dol Guldur, they drove him to Mordor, which was where he had wanted to go. They disrupted his operation in southern Mirkwood without destroying him or containing him, and the disruption merely accelerated the timeline of his recovery by pushing him back to his preferred base of power. An imperfect action performed decisively can sometimes be better than a perfect action delayed indefinitely. What the council did was neither decisive nor particularly delayed. It was timely in the sense that it responded to an obvious threat, and insufficient in the sense that it did not address the actual problem, only its most locally visible manifestation, Saruman's private corruption, running in parallel with the council's formal deliberations across all those centuries, operated on a principle that deserves examination because it is a principle we can recognize from contexts much smaller and more personal than the governance of an age. He told himself, for a very long time, that his desire for the ring was compatible with his official purpose, that wanting the ring and wanting to use it against Sauron were the same desire, that the personal motivation and the public duty were aligned. They were not aligned. They had not been aligned for centuries by the time the War of the Ring began, but the human and the Maya capacity for self-convincing is remarkable, and Saruman had convinced himself so thoroughly that by the time he was actively working against the quest, actively trying to ensure that the ring reached him rather than the fire, he seems to have believed that this was still, in some sense, the right thing for Middle-earth. He was wrong. He was perhaps the most elaborately wrong person in the whole story, because the wrongness had been so carefully constructed over so long a time. Gandalf's approach was different, and the difference is worth tracing carefully. Where Saruman had a theory of the ring and a plan for the ring, and a comprehensive strategic vision of how the ring would eventually serve as the instrument of Sauron's defeat, Gandalf had something simpler and in the end more durable, an instinct about people. He had spent 1,000 years walking in Middle-earth, not in the courts of kings, not primarily in the councils of the wise, but in ordinary places, in the roads between towns, in the houses of ordinary people, in the conversations that happen when no one powerful is watching. He had developed, through that long accumulation of ordinary contact, a capacity for recognizing quality of character that was less systematic than Saruman's approach, and less susceptible to the kind of comprehensive error that systematic approaches make when their first principles are corrupted. When Gandalf met Bilbo Baggins in the Shire, something recognized something. Not the ring. Gandalf did not know about the ring yet, or at least not fully. What he recognized was a quality in the Hobbit community that his instincts told him was worth attending to. Something unexpected and hardy in those small and seemingly insignificant people. Something that had not been shaped by ambition or by the desire for greatness. something that had developed over generations of quiet living into a kind of strength that was genuinely different from the strengths the more impressive races of Middle-earth had developed. He could not have articulated it in the early years of his attention to the Shire. He just paid attention, the way a careful gardener pays attention to a plant that does not look like much, but has survived conditions that other plants did not. The Council's failure to plan adequately for the ring, to ask with real seriousness where it was and what should be done when it was found, left the Third Age dependent on an improvised solution that succeeded not because of the Council's wisdom, but in spite of the Council's limitations. The Fellowship of the Ring was assembled at Rivendell, and Elrond himself was clear that the choice of Frodo as ring-bearer was one he did not feel capable of making for certain, that perhaps Frodo was chosen in the sense that the ring came to him, and that this had to be enough evidence to proceed on, because there was no other evidence available, and the time for deliberation was past. This is not the careful, comprehensive planning of a wise council at the height of its power. This is wise people doing the best they can under conditions of genuine uncertainty with very limited time. Something in that improvisation, in that gathering of 9 walkers from different peoples who are often in conflict with each other, in that choice to entrust the greatest danger in the world to the smallest and least prepared of them, was actually closer to the right solution than any of the more strategic approaches the Council had contemplated. Sauron expected strategy. He expected that the ring, if found, would be claimed by someone powerful enough to want to challenge him. He expected Gandalf or Galadriel or Aragorn to take the ring and attempt to use it, and he was prepared for that. He was not prepared for the ring to walk toward Orodruin in the pocket of someone who had no desire to use it, who wanted only to put it down somewhere final and go home. His preparations were comprehensive, but they were calibrated for the wrong opponent. The Council of the Wise, despite its centuries of accumulated knowledge, did not design that solution. It arrived from elsewhere. Let your mind rest on that for a moment before we move forward. The wisest people in a world full of extraordinary people could not solve the problem that required solving. The solution that worked came from an unexpected direction, through a chain of coincidences and chances that the characters in the story often speak of as if they might be something more than coincidences. As if there is a will in the world that is different from Sauron's will, a different kind of order than the order Sauron was trying to impose, one that works through small things and through the unnoticed and through the apparently insufficient. That possibility is something the story holds open rather than resolving. It is something you can think about, or not think about, in the quiet of this late hour. Either way, the night holds it safely. The meeting at Rivendell, where the Fellowship was formed, is one of the most carefully described councils in the entire narrative, and it rewards attention as a study in how very wise people make decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty. Elrond opened it by saying that they had been called together by that which Ilúvatar had appointed, meaning the ring, meaning that the ring's own tendency to seek a hand and to move toward power had brought it to Rivendell, and that tendency was itself a form of guidance, however paradoxical it seemed to follow the corrupted thing toward wisdom. The accounts he gave of the ring's history were comprehensive. The speeches made by Boromir of Gondor arguing for the use of the ring as a weapon against Sauron were serious arguments from a man of genuine intelligence who could not be lightly dismissed. The response that the ring could not be used because it was itself Sauron's will and would ultimately bend any user towards Sauron's purposes, was not immediately persuasive to everyone in the room. It required the specific wisdom of beings who had thought about the ring for much longer than Boromir had to make the case convincingly. Aragorn's role at that council was also significant in ways that do not always receive sufficient attention. He was there as the heir of Isildur, which meant he was there as the living consequence of the mistake made at Orodruin 2,500 years earlier. He knew this. He had grown up knowing it, had been told by Elrond the full account of his lineage and its implications, had spent decades as a ranger in the north, in what was partly a form of penance for an error he had not committed, but for which his line bore historical responsibility. When he spoke at the council, he spoke with the specific weight of that knowledge. The knowledge that the mistake had been possible, that it had been made by someone genuinely trying to do right, and that the only answer to it was not regret but the sustained effort to create conditions in which the opportunity to make the right choice would come again and someone would be ready to take it. The Fellowship was, in part, Aragorn trying to be ready. The choice of the 9 members of the Fellowship was itself a piece of wisdom that the Council did not entirely consciously make. 9 walkers to set against 9 riders. The symmetry was noted, and the symmetry was more than aesthetic. The Nazgûl were 9 because the 9 rings had been given to 9 men. The Fellowship was 9 because 9 different peoples and purposes needed to be represented in what was, at its most fundamental level, an argument being made to the world about what kind of world it wanted to be. The Nazgûl were the argument for dominion, 9 individuals whose individual wills had been subsumed into a single purpose. The Fellowship was the counter-argument, 9 individuals who retained their individual wills and their individual purposes, and chose, from those different purposes, a common course of action. It held together for a while, and then it broke, as 9 different wills with 9 different purposes will eventually do. But the breaking did not end the argument. It just distributed it across the landscape of Middle-earth, where it had to be made individually by each of the 9 in the circumstances they found themselves in after the breaking. We are near the end now, or near the end of the story as it is usually told. The hour is what it is, late or early, depending on how you reckon it, and you have been travelling through a very long history for a very long time, and that is a kind of effort, even when it is also a kind of rest. And both of those things are worth acknowledging. We are at the mountain. We are at the place where everything converges, where the long threads of 12,000 years of history in this world, from Mairon in Ollë's workshop, through the making, through the long defeats and the longer rebuildings, through Númenor and the Nazgûl, and the White Council's partial wisdom, where all of those threads arrive at a single point of fire at the heart of Sauron's own territory. And we are going to spend some time with what happened there, because what happened there is more complex than the summary usually suggests. Frodo Baggins at the crack of doom was not the Frodo Baggins who had left Bag End with the ring in his pocket 18 months earlier. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the final moments of the story, because accounts that focus on the ring's destruction as a heroic act miss the actual nature of what happened. By the time Frodo stood at the edge of the fire, the ring had been working on him for the entire length of the journey, slowly at first, then with increasing force as the distance to Orodruin decreased and the ring's connection to the power of that place grew stronger. He had carried it across the misty mountains, through Moria, through the long approach to Mordor, up the slopes of the mountain itself. Each step had been made against a resistance that was not physical. The ring was famously light, but was entirely psychological and spiritual, a constant accumulating pressure toward inaction, toward turning back, toward giving up, toward finding some reason that the mission was unnecessary or impossible, or simply not his responsibility. And at the edge of the fire, after all of that, he could not do it. He stood there and he looked into the fire that had made the ring and would unmake it, and he could not let go. Not because he had failed, not because his character had proved insufficient, but because the ring at that proximity to its own place of making was operating with a force that exceeded the capacity of any individual will to resist entirely. He could have been Galadriel or Gandalf or Aragorn, beings of vastly greater power than a hobbit from the Shire, and they would not have done better. He had gotten there. Getting there was the achievement. What happened next was not his doing, and was not his failure. Gollum arrived. Gollum, who had followed them all the way from the edge of the dead marshes, who had tracked them through Mordor with the obsessive precision of a creature for whom the ring was the only purpose remaining in its existence, who had made himself almost invisible during the final ascent because the ring was pulling at him as strongly as it was at Frodo, perhaps more strongly. Gollum arrived at exactly the moment that Frodo had made the decision to keep the ring rather than destroy it. He bit off Frodo's finger. He took the ring. He danced at the edge of the fire with it, and then he fell. Whether he fell accidentally or whether something in his own ancient relationship with the ring, Something about the strange love that was the ring's most disturbing quality in Gollum, purer than any other bearer's attachment, because it was almost entirely stripped of ambition and was simply a matter of the ring being his. Whether something in that relationship made him prefer falling with the ring to surrendering it, the accounts leave genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that the ring fell into the fire of Orodruin, and what happened then was not simply an explosion or a destruction in the ordinary sense of those words. The fire that had made the ring knew what it was receiving. The unmaking was as precise as the making had been, and as costly. The ring dissolved. And as it dissolved, what had been poured into it, the will of Sauron, the concentrated essence of his ordering intelligence, the fire of his Maya nature that had survived every previous defeat by anchoring itself in the ring's continued existence, that had nowhere left to anchor, it dispersed. It scattered across the fabric of Middle-earth in fragments that were too small and too separated to reconstitute into anything purposeful. It was not quite death, in the sense that Tolkien was clear that Sauron could not be utterly destroyed by this means, but it was permanent incapacity. The self that had been Mairon, that had been Annatar, that had been the Dark Lord of the Third Age, lost its coherence. Permanently. There would be no rebuilding this time. The source of the rebuilding was gone. The tower of Barad-dûr fell in that moment. The armies of Mordor, which had been held in something approximating coherence by the extension of Sauron's will through the mechanisms of command and fear that he had constructed, collapsed into chaos. Not because every individual soldier lost the will to fight, but because the structure that had organised their fighting into something purposeful disintegrated simultaneously across the entire theatre of war. The Nazgûl, who had existed as extensions of Sauron's will given form and movement, were destroyed in those same moments. Their rings had no power left. The beings they had enslaved, the shadows of the men they had once been, had nothing left to animate them. They dissolved. In one of the more poetic details of the account, the flying creatures they rode dissolved too, and the darkness that had covered the sky above Mordor for so long broke apart and light came through, and it was, by all accounts, extraordinary light. The kind of light that feels like the first light, like something that had been absent for so long that its return registers as almost painful in its brightness. But what was actually lost in that moment? This is the question we should sit with, the question that the story's triumphant conclusion tends to rush past. Yes, Sauron was defeated. Yes, the darkness was broken. Yes, the free peoples of Middle-earth would not be enslaved. Those are real and enormous goods, and the story earns its celebration of them. But the unmaking of the One Ring also unmade the three, Nenya, Narya, Vilya, not by destroying them physically, but by draining them of the power that had been their operating principle. The three elven rings had worked through the same fundamental architecture as the One Ring, and the One Ring's destruction severed the connection that had made that architecture functional. Lorien's preservation began to fail from that day. Rivendell's quality of time, that quality that made visitors feel they had stepped into an earlier age, began to dissipate. The forest that had been held in something like their earlier fullness by the influence of the rings began the slow, ordinary process of change and diminishment. The elves who had carried the rings, Galadriel, Elrond, Círdan, had already known this would happen. They had chosen to carry the rings and to use them for preservation, in full knowledge that when Sauron was defeated, their rings' effectiveness would end. They had chosen, in other words, to build beautiful things that could not last forever, in full awareness that they could not last forever, because the alternative was to build nothing at all and watch the deterioration happen faster. There is something in that choice, the decision to make something beautiful and temporary rather than nothing at all, that deserves more attention than it usually receives. They were not deluded about the impermanence. They chose beauty within the limits of the possible, rather than abstaining from beauty because the limits were real. Frodo, When the ring was destroyed and the mountain broke and the eagles came and he was rescued from the slopes of Orodruin, along with Sam, did not come back whole. He was never quite the same person he had been when he left Bag End. The wound in his soul from carrying the ring, and the literal wound in his hand, did not fully heal in Middle-earth. He sailed from the Grey Havens at the end of the story with the ring-bearers and the elves and Gandalf into the west, toward whatever form of healing that place could offer, and Sam, who had been with him through everything, watched the white ship disappear over the horizon and then turned around and went home, because he had a life waiting for him that could be lived, and living it was the right thing to do, and he did it. That turning, that moment of Sam Gamgee turning away from the sea and back toward the Shire, is, in its way, as significant as the moment the ring fell into the fire. It is the answer to the question of what you do after the enormous thing is over and the world has changed and you are still in it. You are still in it too. You're in the ordinary dark of an ordinary night, and the story has brought you here through 12,000 years of Tolkien's world, and the fire of Orodruin has done what it was going to do, and there is nothing left to worry about on behalf of Middle-earth. The watch is nearly ended, but not quite yet. One more thought remains. One more thing about what the ring's destruction meant that the story usually does not say directly, but that the shape of everything that follows implies. We will come to it. Let yourself drift toward it rather than reaching for it. It is there in the quiet, waiting. Sam's presence on the mountain at the end, the way he carried Frodo when Frodo could not carry himself, and carried the ring by extension without touching it, without any of its power reaching him because it was simply a weight attached to a person he loved, and his love for the person was more present than any awareness of the ring. This is the moment that the story has been building toward without quite naming it. The ring's strategy of making itself the most important thing in its bearer's consciousness depended on the bearer's own self being the reference point, on the bearer wanting something for himself, being someone who could be offered more of themselves than they currently had. Sam had almost no gap of that kind. He did not want more than he had. He wanted Frodo to be okay. He wanted to go home. He wanted Mr. Bilbo's old armchair and a proper meal and the smell of the Shire in late autumn. These wants were too small and too specific and too concrete for the ring to get a purchase on them. Not because Sam was simple. He was not simple, as anyone who reads his poetry or listens to his observations about elves and stories will understand, but because his desire was outward-facing rather than inward-facing, and the ring was designed for inward-facing desire. The eagles have always attracted commentary in the story. Why didn't Gandalf simply use the eagles to carry the ring to the mountain and drop it in? And the commentary misses the point in a way that is itself instructive about how the ring's influence works. The eagles were not available for that purpose, both logistically and philosophically. But more importantly, the ring could not be carried to its destruction by a being of power. The ring would have worked on a great eagle, would have reached whatever desires an eagle of that magnitude was capable of having, would have found the argument that made the eagle decide to keep it or be diverted from the course. The ring could only be carried to destruction by something that had almost no desires of the kind the ring could work with, and even then only barely, and even then only by the mercy of Gollum's last intervention. The path to the fire was precisely as narrow as the story made it, not because Tolkien was limiting his narrative options, but because the nature of the ring made it genuinely that difficult, and the story was honest about that difficulty. The moment of the ring's actual unmaking, the moment when it dissolved in the fire and Sauron's scattered will dispersed across the fabric of the world, was felt far away. Galadriel felt it in Lorien. Elrond felt it in Rivendell. Gandalf, standing on the slopes outside Minas Tirith with the battle still raging around him, felt it as a sudden clarity, a lifting of a pressure that had been present for so long that its presence had become the background condition of the age. The Nazgûl above the battle felt it as dissolution. The thread that had sustained their existence snapped, and they went out like 9 candle flames in a wind. The armies of Mordor felt it as the removal of the organising intelligence that had been coordinating their actions, and the removal produced exactly the chaos that any complex military machine produces when its central command structure is suddenly and completely destroyed. And the Free Peoples, watching this, had no framework for understanding what had happened, except that something enormous had ended. The age had ended. They were in something new. They did not yet know what it was. There is a quality to this hour of the night that is different from all the other hours. You may have noticed it before, the way that very late or very early, when the dark has been dark for long enough, the world outside seems to simplify itself into something more essential. The noise that fills the daylight hours, the constant texture of activity and demand and response, has become something more like silence, not total silence. Silence underneath, and smaller sounds moving through it. The settling of the house, the breath of wind outside a window, the particular quality of your own breathing, which is slower now than it was when we began. We are at the end of the long history. We are at the place where the ring's destruction resolves into its consequences, and those consequences are not simple, and they are not entirely happy, and that is the thing that the title of this evening's journey was always pointing toward. Destroying the ring made things better. It also made things different in ways that better does not quite capture. The 4th age of Middle-earth, the age that began with the crowning of Aragorn as King Elessar of the reunited kingdom, was in many ways a good age. The great darkness was broken. The long threat of Sauron's domination was ended. Men came into their inheritance as the dominant race of Middle-earth, not by conquest of the other peoples, but by the natural progression of things. The elves departing, the dwarves retreating further into their mountains, the great Maya presences that had shaped and complicated the world for so long either gone or so diminished as to be effectively absent. Men built and governed and made art and told stories, and Aragorn's long reign was by all accounts one of wisdom and justice, and the gentle stewardship of a world recovering from enormous damage. This is real. This happened. It is worth saying clearly before we say anything else. But something was different. Something was quieter. The magic that had been woven through Middle-earth for all the previous ages, the magic that was not a trick or a special effect, but a quality of the world's actual fabric, a permeability between the physical and the spiritual that made places like Lorien and Rivendell and the Old Forest and the Barrow Downs feel unlike ordinary geographical locations. That quality was fading, not all at once, not dramatically, but persistently and in one direction only. The elves who remained were fading or departing. The places they had preserved were losing their preserved quality. The great trees of Fangorn were still great trees, but the Ents who attended them were diminishing in number, their women gone beyond recovery, their future as a people effectively over. The world was becoming, in a specific and technical sense, more ordinary. This is what the destruction of the One Ring actually accomplished at the level of the world's metaphysics. Sauron had poured his power into the ring to control the other rings, and the other rings had used the power available to them. Power that was ultimately architectural in the same structure as the One Ring, even if the Elven Three had never been touched by Sauron directly, to do the work of preservation that their bearers had set them to. When that structure was unmade, the preservation ended, and preservation had been the primary magical work of the Third Age. The whole long effort of the elves who remained in Middle-earth, conducted across 3,000 years, had been the effort to hold some things against time's erosion. That effort was over, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded in its primary purpose, keeping the world viable long enough for the ring to be destroyed, and in succeeding had ended the conditions that made it possible. Tolkien himself spoke, in letters and in the broader mythological materials, of a theory of magic that is relevant here. The power that had been in Middle-earth from the earliest ages, the power that the Valar and the Maiar had brought with them into the world at its making, was not infinite. and was not renewable in the way that sunlight or rain is renewable. It was a finite quality, a dowry given once, and every time a great power was spent in Middle-earth, every time a Maiar used their full capacity in a conflict, every time a ring was destroyed, every time an age ended in enormous violence, the world's total magical capacity diminished slightly. What had been spent could not be recovered. What was gone was gone. The Third Age ended in a great expenditure of that capacity, and the Fourth Age inherited a world that was permanently a little less than the Third Age had been, which was itself less than the Second, which was less than the First, which was less than the years of the trees before the sun was made at all. This might sound like loss only, and in one accounting it is nothing but loss. The world that Frodo and Sam and the Fellowship had fought to save was a lesser world even in its saved state than the world that had existed before Sauron first turned from Aulë's service. Something was always being spent, always being diminished, always moving in one direction. But there is another way to read that same movement, and it is a way that the story itself seems to endorse, quietly and without making a great argument of it. The world of men, the Fourth Age and everything after it, the world that became our world in Tolkien's cosmology, was not magic in the sense that the earlier ages had been magic, but it was inhabited, it was human, it was the world of ordinary courage and ordinary kindness and ordinary love, the world where the scale of things was closer to the scale of a person rather than the scale of an age, and where what mattered was not the great movements of cosmic forces, but the small movements of individual choice. Sam Gamgee going home to the Shire and planting trees, the silver dust from Galadriel that made the Shire grow more beautifully than it had ever been before, and growing a family and being mayor and living a long and quiet life in the place he had always loved. This was not a diminishment in the sense that matters most. Sam's life after the quest was not smaller than the quest. It was the thing the quest was for. It was the proof that the quest had worked. Not the proof that the world was restored to some previous glory, but the proof that the world where ordinary hobbits could live ordinary lives in peace and safety was still there, still viable, still worth the enormous cost that had been paid to preserve it. The ring's destruction preserved the possibility of the ordinary, and the ordinary, it turns out, is not a lesser thing. Sauron never understood this. He could not have. His entire nature, from Mairon's perfectionism through to the ring's absolute insistence on domination, was oriented toward the large, the controlling, the complete. The small was, in his cosmology, merely the not yet organized. The ordinary was the material that needed shaping into something greater. He could not conceive of a world in which the ordinary was the destination rather than the starting point, in which the goal of all the vast historical labour of ages was not a perfect ordered state controlled by a single sufficient intelligence, but a world full of small creatures making small choices in the direction of kindness and warmth and the things they loved. That incapacity to understand the ordinary was not incidental to his evil. It was the source of it. The same refusal to accept that the world's imperfection was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be inhabited. That refusal was what made him what he was, from Aulë's workshop to the last alliance to the fire of Orodruin. Frodo, sailing west, carried a wound that Middle-earth could not heal. But he sailed toward something. The grey ships did not go into nothing. They went toward an accommodation with the costs of having lived through what he had lived through, an accommodation that the ordinary world could not offer him, but that the mercy of the world's makers had arranged to be available for those who needed it. Whether it was enough, whether that accommodation was healing or simply a better kind of endurance, the story does not say. Some questions are left genuinely open. That is not the story's failure. That is its honesty. The histories that answer every question are not accurate histories. They are comfortable ones. The accurate ones leave space for the things that cannot be resolved, for the costs that do not balance against the gains, for the wound that was real and that did not fully close. And so we arrive here, at the edge of everything we have been tracing tonight, at the place where Sauron's story ends in the only way it could end. Not in triumph, not in the way he had designed it to end, but in the specific and permanent dispersal of a self that had refused, for all those thousands of years, to accept the limits of what a self can or should control. The ring is gone. The fire of Orodruin is quiet, or as quiet as a volcano is. The dark tower is rubble. The Third Age is over, and you are here, in your ordinary dark, in your ordinary warmth, with whatever is real and present and yours gathered around you in the night. The stories will be here tomorrow. The history will keep. And now your watch is ended. If you have something to add to the record, where in the world you're keeping your own watch tonight, or what question you're still sitting with, the comments are waiting for you when you wake. For now, let the fire go out. Let the dark be only dark. Let sleep, if it wants to come, come. The departure of the ring-bearers from the Grey Havens in the final pages of the account is one of the most carefully constructed endings in the literature of the last century, and its care is worth acknowledging in these late quiet hours. Frodo, Gandalf, Bilbo, the three who had carried the ring, in very different ways and for very different lengths of time, sailed together. With them went Galadriel and Elrond and Celeborn, the great elvish powers whose rings had sustained the preservation of the Third Age, and who could no longer sustain that preservation once the One Ring was unmade. The party on the dock was those who remained: Sam, Merry, Pippin and Legolas and Gimli, who would follow later in their own time. And then the ship sailed, and then it was gone, and then Sam came home to Bag End and sat in his chair and thought about it for a while, before his family came to welcome him, and that was the end. The departures from the Grey Havens were not deaths. They were a form of transition specific to Tolkien's cosmology, a passage to a place that was, in some sense, outside the ordinary circles of the world, where the damage done by carrying the ring could be addressed in ways that Middle-earth's declining magic could no longer address. Whether those departures resulted in healing, in rest, in a form of continued existence meaningfully different from the slow fading that awaited the elves who remained behind, this is one of the story's genuinely open questions. The elves who sailed did not return to tell their experience. The accounts simply end at the dock, with the white ship passing over the horizon, and Sam coming home to the Shire, where the new trees were growing that he had planted from Galadriel's gift, and where the world was quieter and more ordinary than it had been, and was also, in its quiet, ordinary way, still beautiful. What Tolkien was doing with the shape of this ending, and what makes it feel so precisely right despite its apparent sadness, is something that the sleep-quiet hours of the night are particularly well equipped to receive. He was not writing about triumph. He was writing about the cost of victory and the particular kind of sadness that comes with endings that are also genuinely good, with losses that are real even when the thing they purchased was worth the price. The world of the Fourth Age was less than the world of the Third Age in terms of magic and in terms of the presence of the extraordinary. It was more in terms of the ordinary. It was the world of men, and men in Tolkien's mythology carry something specific that the elves do not: the capacity to find the world's impermanence beautiful rather than tragic, the ability to love things precisely because they end. Frodo's departure and Sam's staying were not two versions of failure. They were two different answers to the same question, about how you live after the enormous thing is done, and both answers were honest, and both were sufficient, and the world that contained both of them was not diminished by containing them both. The watch is ended now. The fire is out. Sleep well. If the story is carrying you towards sleep, let it carry you all the way. Subscribe so the next long night's journey is waiting when you return. Sleep well,